Hey everybody, and welcome to ARE Live. I'm Chris Hopstock, Architect Education Specialist here at Black Spectacles and your host for ARE Live. Today, we're going to be joined by guest expert Emily Eppel, who's going to be walking through different aspects of the A201. If you think of any questions you'd like to ask Emily during the Q&A, make sure to post them in the webinar chat. There will also be a page in our ARE community after the episode if you think of more questions after the broadcast. Our next ARE Live will be June 15th, 2023, where we'll be discussing zoning ordinances. You can go to go.blackspectacles.com/podcast to sign up. To learn more about the study materials Black Spectacles offers or to watch this episode again later, go to go.blackspectacles.com. Although all of our episodes are available in both video and podcast audio formats after the broadcast, we'll be sharing our screen during today's live, so we recommend watching the webinar to better see how we work through the material. So with that, I'd like to welcome today's guest, Emily Eppel. Emily is a workshop instructor with us at Black Spectacles, where she teaches the Practice Management Division, and she is a registered architect living and working in New York, my home state. She's also a returning host on ARE Live, so welcome back, Emily.
Hi, Chris. Yeah, thanks for having me again. I'm excited to work through this one today.
Yeah, we're happy to have you back. So before we get started, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the A201. We're going to be going through 6 questions today, and with the exception of the first one, none of these questions actually use the words A201. And I think that's really common on ARE questions. The A201 sort of sets the stage for a lot of the roles and responsibilities and procedures that happen, particularly during the construction administration phase of a project. So when you get a question that's asking you about who should do what or what should the architect do during CA, even though the question doesn't say or refer to the A201, it probably has the answer in there. So it's a really foundational document for you to understand before taking the ARE. For a long time, the ARE guidelines listed the A201 as a reference for the PJM divisions and CE. It still does, but they recently added it as a reference to the PCM division as well. So half of the ARE divisions expect you to understand the A201 and be able to apply it to situations to understand how the architect or how the project team should handle a specific situation. So with that preamble, let's get into question 1. Emily, take it away.
Great. So I'll go ahead and I'll read the questions first, and then I'll just go through each of the answers and my viewpoints on why I think they might be right or wrong. So we'll go ahead and get started. An architect is beginning work on a design bid build project that will be competitively bid. The architect is going to contract with the owner using the B101, and the owner will eventually contract with the lowest bidder using the A101. The project team will use the A201 as the general conditions for the contract for construction. Which of the following describe the role of A201? Check the 2 that apply. Our options are incorporated by reference into A101, signed by owner, architect, and contractor, establishes construction costs, defines key terms used throughout A101 and B101, establishes architect's fee, and provides a list of additional and supplemental services. So I do think on these check 2 that apply questions, which are very common on the exam, it's best to go ahead and go through every option. Just start at the top and work your way down, because sometimes there might be 3 options that you do think work, but you want to pick the best 2 when you're told to only select 2. So you need to make sure you're reading all your options on these. So let's start at the beginning with incorporated by reference into A101. So right away, I'm leaning towards yes on this one, just with my knowledge of the A101, the B101, and the A201. I do think this is incorporated as a reference into the A101. But like I said, we need to review all of our options to know what are the best 2 answers. So let's keep this as an option for now and come back to it. So our next option is signed by owner, architect, and contractor. So the A201 is not a contract that gets signed. Think of it more as a document that goes with the other contracts, the B101 and the A101, but it's not signed itself. So I can go ahead and mark off this option because I know it is not going to be a correct answer. So I'd go ahead and just cross that off. Next, we have establishes construction cost. So again, I'm leaning towards no on this one. The B101 and the A101 are where you're going to see the construction cost. The A201 is not a document that you're filling in with information like you do in the B101 or the A101. So if you're familiar with those documents, on the first couple pages, there are places where you would fill in the construction costs and like timeline and that kind of thing. You don't have that on the A201. So I would go ahead and cross this off as well. Next, we have defines key terms used throughout A101 and B101. So just by knowing the full name of the A201, which is general conditions of the construction contract, I'm leaning towards this as being a correct answer. If the A201 is describing general conditions, it's probably going to include and define those key terms that are in the main two contracts, the A101 and the B101. So I do think this could be a correct answer, so I'll just leave it blank for now. Next, we have establishes the architect's fee. So this would be the B101, the owner architect agreement. So just knowing the full names of all of these documents can help you make inferences to answer these questions properly. So the architect's fee would be in the owner architect agreement, not in the A201. So I will cross that off as well. And then next, sorry, that is supposed to be crossing it off, not circling it. And next we have provides a list of additional and supplemental services. And again, just from my knowledge of the B101, I know that it is the B101 that has the list of additional and supplemental services in section 4. So it is not the A201. So that leaves us with 3 options left. So we have incorporated by reference into the A101 and defines key terms used throughout the A101 and the B101. Sorry, I just realized provides a list. I meant to cross that off. And that leaves us with the 2 correct answers. So our correct answers are incorporated by reference into the A101 and defines key terms used throughout the A101 and the B101. So the A201 is the general conditions of the construction contract. It is a document that provides the terms and conditions under which the three main parties, which are the owner, contractor, and architect, are going to work together during the construction process. So it is referenced by both the A101 and the B101. And I also just want to highlight again that if you know the full names of each of these contracts, the B101, the A101, and the A201, just the full names can help you eliminate possible other answers and help you figure out the right answers and pick the right document. So if you're talking about the owner-architect relationship and you know that the B101 is the owner-architect agreement, that can help you narrow down your possible answers.
Yeah, thanks for that, Emily. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about the mechanics of this question when we're writing practice questions and when folks are writing questions for the actual ARE. There's kind of levels to questions that you'll see. This is more of a knowledge of question. You're either going to know the answer to this question or you're not. So it's kind of a lower level, and then they can build up to questions that ask you to apply certain information to a situation, all the way to questions like drag and drop questions that ask you to actually create something. So I think it's helpful when you're taking practice exams to think about the level of the question and sort of think about how many questions you're getting asked that are simply asking you, do you know this one piece of information, versus questions that ask you to apply or create things. We put this question in today's webinar because we really wanted to introduce the A201 and talk about how it relates to the other contracts that are typically used on construction projects. So keep that in mind. Let's move on to question 2.
Question 2. An architect is working on an addition to a school during the contract administration phase. The contract documents call for a new ADA compliant ramp with a 1 to 12 slope at one of the entrances to the building. The contractor built the ramp, but the architect noted that the slope of the ramp at the transition to the walkway is 1 to 11. The contractor believes this to be within the allowable concrete tolerances. Which of the following is an appropriate action for the project team to take? Check the 3 that apply, and our options are: the owner could provide notice to the contractor that they'll hire another contractor to revise the ramp. The architect could issue a construction change directive for the contractor to revise the ramp. The architect could withhold the entire payment for the contractor's next pay application. The architect could prepare a change order if the owner hires another contractor to fix the ramp. The owner could direct the contractor to stop the work. The architect could discuss the issue with the AHJ and request a variance. So again, since we're checking the 3 that apply, we want to make sure we are picking the best 3. So we're going to go through each of these answer options. So we'll start with the first one. The owner could provide notice to the contractor that they'll hire another contractor to revise the ramp. So my first thought here is that this could be a correct answer, but since we are choosing the best 3, I do want to still go ahead and keep this as a maybe and look to see what the other options could be. So let's keep going. The architect could issue a construction change directive for the contractor to revise the ramp. So I think I would go ahead and eliminate this as a possible answer because a construction change directive is used to direct work during the construction process when the price hasn't been agreed upon. In this scenario, the ramp is already built. So construction change directive doesn't apply well to this scenario. So let me just grab my pen and we'll go ahead and cross that off. Next, we have the architect could withhold the entire payment for the contractor's next pay application. So my first thought here is that this seems extreme. Could the architect withhold payment? Maybe, but is that the best course of action? Maybe not. So maybe this ramp makes up only like 1% of the next pay application. Would it make sense to withhold the entire payment? Probably not. So I'm leaning towards no on this one. I think I'm going to go ahead and cross this off. We can always come back to it if we don't find others that we think work. So the next option is the architect could prepare a change order if the owner hires another contractor to fix the ramp. So this option seems like kind of a follow-up step to that first option. So right away, I am considering this as a possible option. And here's where I would use my knowledge of the A201 to help me make a confident decision here. So it's section 2.5 of the A201, and it's about the owner's right to carry out the work. So let me see if I can skip to the next slide to show that. Okay, so right here is what we're talking about, 2.5, the owner's right to carry out the work. If the contractor defaults or neglects to carry out the work in accordance with the contract documents and fails within a 10-day period after receipt of notice from the owner to commence and continue correction of such default or neglect, with diligence and promptness, the owner may, without prejudice to other remedies the owner may have, correct such default or neglect. So I think that's saying that the owner has the right to do this option. They have the right to hire another contractor to revise the work if the first contractor won't do it. And in this scenario, let's go back to that. There is a line, let's see. There is a line that says the contractor believes this to be within the allowable concrete tolerances. So that makes me assume that he's not going to be correcting his own work. He doesn't think he messed up, so it doesn't seem like he's going to fix it. So section 2.5 makes me believe that yes, the owner can hire another contractor and have the architect prepare a change order for the work to be done by another contractor. So I'm going to keep that as a right answer, and let's read the next one. The owner could direct the contractor to stop the work. So here's another option that we find in the A201. It was actually right above the section we just read. So it's section 2.4. And that's the owner's right to stop the work. And essentially, it is confirming that if the contractor does not correct the work that did not follow the construction documents, the owner has the right to direct the contractor to stop work. Again, from that line in the scenario, we are assuming that the contractor is refusing to correct his work and that they did not follow the construction documents, or we know that they did not follow the construction documents. So this is definitely, this definitely seems like a possible option. I'm just going to read the last one just to make sure that we have our best three options. So our last option is the architect could discuss the issue with the AHJ, the authority having jurisdiction, and request a variance. So ultimately, ADA concerns are a federal issue, so it's probably not the best course of action to request a variance from the local AHJ, as you could run into issues federally. Also, a variance typically has to do with zoning requirements, not something like the ADA compliant ramp. So that's also a little bit of a red flag that would make me go ahead and eliminate this as an option. And just as like a test taking thing for the ARE. I feel like a lot of the other questions kind of, or the answer possibilities kind of relate to each other. This one seems like a bit of an outlier to me. So that just gives me a little extra confidence to know that it's probably not the correct answer if it doesn't seem to be fitting with the other two possible answers. So I would go ahead and eliminate that. So after reading all the possible answers, I think that left us with the three. So let me click to the answer slide. Yes, that left us with three options that I could confidently point to those two sections in the A201 to answer. So the answers were the owner could provide notice to the contractor that they'll hire another contractor to revise the ramp. The architect could prepare a change order if the owner hires another contractor to fix the ramp, and the owner could direct the contractor to stop the work. So these are our best three options. This is where knowledge of at least the A201 section names and titles can be super helpful on the exam. You can't assume that you're going to be lucky enough to actually have the A201 as a reference on the exam to be able to actually like dive into these sections. But if you know these section titles, like that name, the owner's right to stop the work, gives you a hint that the owner can stop the work, which is some of is said in these options. So just knowing the titles can help you a lot. So when you're studying, try to remember those, and that can help you make confident decisions during the exam.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point about answering questions like this, because like I was saying earlier, this question doesn't really seem like it's about the A201, but having a general familiarity with what the different project team members can and can't do during a construction project, which is all outlined in the A201, will help you after you read this question realize that this question is really asking about your knowledge of that document. I also wanted to point out that the third option here, withholding the entire payment, is a bit of it uses the extreme word entire. Whenever you see extreme words in answer choices, I would be pretty cautious about selecting those. Something other words like always or never come to mind, but whenever you see a choice like that, just think twice about it, because it's very rarely the case that you would always do something or never do something, or that you would withhold the entire payment. Emily, if you could go back to the previous slide just for a quick second, the snippet from the A201. The last thing I wanted to say about this one is just give some advice on how to read through these really heavy legal paragraphs that are super dense. So Emily was reading in 2.5 before, where it talks about the owner may, without prejudice to other remedies the owner may have, correct such default or neglect. That middle phrase in between the commas is kind of, it's not irrelevant. It's certainly important. It simply means that if the owner does this, they still, they're not saying this is my only course of action. That's what that means. But what I wanted to say was, just after you read this the first time, just reread it without the parts that are in the commas. So just read, the owner may correct such default or neglect, and that'll help you on the second read of some of these long sentences, internalize them a little bit better without all of these sort of like offshoots within the paragraph. So with that, let's move on to number 3.
All right, so 3 says, a contractor is working on the demolition of a commercial space according to the demo plan provided by the architect. The contractor notifies the architect that they weren't anticipating the existing wood flooring to be glued down, and that demolishing the flooring is going to take an additional 2 days of work and will also require an additional $5,000. The contractor notes that the architect's demolition notes don't specify that the flooring is glued. Which of the following are appropriate responses from the architect? Check the 2 that apply. Our options are issue a change order for an additional 2 days to be added to the schedule, issue a change order for an additional $5,000 to be added to the contract price, direct the contractor to proceed with the demolition by issuing a construction change directive, notify the contractor and owner that the conditions don't warrant an adjustment to the contract time or price, and suggest that the owner hire another contractor to demolish the flooring if the contractor won't demolish it, and issue a minor change in the work describing how the flooring should be removed. So my first thoughts here is that I'm leaning towards a change order not being appropriate. Wood floor being glued down is not so uncommon that the contractor couldn't have anticipated that this might be the case. So there is a section of the A201 that I think works as a nice reference in this situation. It is section 3.7.4, concealed or unknown conditions. They essentially say if the contractor encounters conditions that are materially different from the CDs or unusual in nature, the architect can investigate and determine if there should be an increase in the contractor's cost or time. If the architect decides that they are not unusual or materially different from the construction documents, then no change to the contract is justified. So again, it just goes back to the wood floor being glued down to not be an uncommon thing. The contractor seems to have made the assumption that the floor was just nailed down, but they could have also made the assumption, the more conservative assumption, that maybe it was glued, and they could have adjusted their schedule and their bid to reflect the worst in the situation, the worst case scenario, but they chose not to do that. So that's not the fault of the architect or the owner. So that leads me to eliminate the first 2 choices and the last choice. The first 2 choices are both about change orders, and the last choice, issue a minor change in the work. We're still removing the original wood flooring. So that's not a change. Like, they still have to remove the same thing. So I would eliminate that as an option as well. So that leaves us with direct the contractor to proceed with the demolition by using a construction change directive, notify the contractor and owner that the conditions don't warrant an adjustment to the contract time or price, and suggest that the owner hire another contractor to demolish the flooring if the contractor won't demolish it. So we are only choosing 2 here, so we need to eliminate 1 more. The construction change directive option, again, insinuates that there is something wrong or different from our construction documents, and that's not the case. So I would eliminate that option as well, which leaves us with notify the contractor and owner that the conditions don't warrant an adjustment to the contract time or price, and suggest that the owner hire another contractor to demolish the flooring if the contractor won't demolish it, as our correct 2 answers. So just based off those sections in the A201, I do think, and also the owner's right to carry out the work in the A201, I do think these are the best 2 options available.
Yeah, I agree. And I just wanted to point out that the last option here is wrong for kind of 2 reasons. Obviously, it's not a change in the work as Emily described, but I think it's also wrong because of the second part of the choice, which is describing how the flooring should be removed. The architect that sounds like means and methods to me. The architect should never be describing how the contractor should be doing anything, because that's the contractor's responsibility. So I know when you're taking the ARE, you have limited time, usually 2.5 minutes per question is the average. So if you realize that a choice is wrong, you don't necessarily have to go through that whole thought process and find another reason why it's wrong. You can just move on like Emily did. But just for the sake of discussion, I just wanted to point out another reason why you might eliminate that choice.
Yeah, definitely a good point there for sure. We'll go ahead and move on to question 4. An architect reviewed the submittal for appliances on a multifamily housing project, which was prepared by the contractor's appliance supplier. On the first review of the submittal, the architect noted that the dishwashers in the studios were the incorrect models and requested the contractor to resubmit the submittal. The contractor resubmitted the submittal with the correct dishwashers, which were bubbled on the new submittal. The contractor also revised the model for the trash disposal because the previously submitted model has too long of a lead time. The contractor didn't bubble that change, and the architect approved the submittal. When observing the project after the appliances are installed, the owner is upset that the incorrect trash disposals were installed because they view the installed units as inferior to the specified units. Which party is likely to be found to be responsible at a dispute resolution hearing for purchasing new trash disposal units? Our options are the architect, the contractor, the appliance supplier, and the owner. So right away, I think it's safe to eliminate the appliance supplier as a possible answer. They informed the contractor of the original lead time issues, and the contractor chose a different model with a shorter lead time. So the appliance supplier supplied the new model as they were directed by the contractor. So I would say they're not at fault here. And in general, I feel like the ARE is hardly ever going to place blame on a party outside of the owner, architect, contractor, consultant realms. Just like as a rule of thumb, the exams are focusing on those relationships. So in my experience, they're never really going to be pointing you in this direction of like a supplier. So I would go ahead and eliminate that option. Next, I'm going to eliminate the owner as an option here. So the owner is the one that's not getting what they thought they were getting in the scenario. So I think we're deciding who failed the owner. So that just leaves us with the architect or the contractor as possible answers. And the A201 has several sections that provide relevant information about the submittal process. So I would go ahead and write down all of these section numbers that I'm showing here on the screen, but I'm going to specifically focus on 3.12.8 and 3.12.9. And I'm going to paraphrase a little bit just so we don't have to read all of the extra confusing language that Chris mentioned earlier. So 3.12.8 says the contractor should not be relieved of responsibility for deviations from the construction documents per the architect's approval of submittals unless the contractor has specifically notified the architect of such deviation at the time of the submittal. So the specifically notified part is important here. And then 3.12.9 says the contractor shall direct specific attention to revisions other than those requested by the architect. So if we go back to our scenario, the architect was reviewing a resubmittal of a dishwater submittal that was bubbled appropriately, but then the contractor also included a new trash disposal, but did not bubble the new trash disposal. So because they did not direct specific attention to it, the contractor is likely going to be the one found responsible in this dispute because they were not following what 3.12.8 and 3.12.9 tells them to do. So the correct answer is contractor. Sorry, go ahead, Chris.
Thanks, Emily. That was great. It's kind of an aside. It's not really relevant to this question, but I just wanted to point out that if you see a question like this and the choices are architect, contractor, owner, and maybe a subcontractor, supplier, whoever, and they're asking you who's going to be responsible for something, the owner is going to be responsible for it if nobody else is responsible. So the owner can be responsible for issues on a project if nobody else is. They're the default responsibility. If in this situation, the architect did everything right, the contractor did everything right, and still we had the wrong trash disposal units, the owner would have to pay for the new ones if they really wanted new ones. And that all comes down to the spear and gap concept, which I'll paraphrase. We cover it pretty well in our new PCM videos, but basically if the architect's acting within their standard of care and the contractor's following those drawings and following the specs, and there's still a problem on the project, the owner is the responsible party. So keep that in mind. The owner can be responsible even if they're not at fault, I guess is the simple way of saying that. So I think we can move on to number 5.
Great. So question 5 says, an architect's specifications call for delegated design of the storefront system for a new retail space. The contractor submits the submittal for the storefront system to the architect, which was designed by a local structural engineer. How should the architect process the submittal? Our options are return as not reviewed, review for conformance with the design criteria, review for conformance with the manufacturer's standard storefront details, and issue an ASI with additional storefront details to be incorporated into the revised submission. So for this question, there is again a specific section of the A201 that tells us what the architect should do in this scenario concerning delegated design. The issue here is the A201 doesn't specifically say delegated design. It essentially just describes what delegated design is. So this is where actually knowing the content of the contracts is important, because if you just use like the search function to look up delegated design, it's not going to help you find that in the A201. So knowing the content is super important. But the section number is 3.12.10.1. And I'll go ahead and I'll read out what it has to say. So I am going to read this because I think the first part really kind of describes what the process is with delegated design, and then the latter part describes what the architect's responsibilities are. So I think it's all pretty relevant. So if professional design services or certifications by a design professional related to systems, materials, or equipment are specifically required of the contractor by the contract documents, the owner and the architect will specify all performance and design criteria that such services must satisfy. So I would just highlight that part that's telling us what the architect will do. We're specifying the performance and design criteria. The contractor shall be entitled to rely upon the adequacy and accuracy of the performance and design criteria provided in the contract documents. The contractor shall cause such services or certifications to be provided by an appropriately licensed design professional whose signature and seal shall appear on all drawings, calculations, specifications, certifications, shop drawings, and other submittals prepared by such professional. Shop drawings and other submittals related to the work designed or certified by such, designed or certified by such professional, if prepared by others, shall bear such professional's written approval when submitted to the architect. The owner and the architect shall be entitled to rely upon the adequacy and accuracy of the services, certifications, and approvals performed or provided by such design professionals, provided the owner and architect have specified to the contractor the performance and design criteria that such services must satisfy. Pursuant to this section 3.12.10, the architect will review and approve or take other appropriate action on submittals only for the limited purposes of checking for conformance with information given at the design concept and the design concept expressed in the contract documents. Okay, so I just read a ton. I agree the language is always pretty extra and confusing. So the latter half is what is most important to our question. So the architect should be reviewing the submittal and making sure it is in conformance with the information we as the architect provided, but we're entitled to rely on the accuracy that other design professional for aspects outside of the design criteria we gave. So storefronts are a good example of something that's commonly done with delegated design. So maybe we're just saying, well, it needs to fit in this 10 by 10 square. It needs to have tempered glass. And then we're leaving all the like mullion detailing up to this other professional. So I don't think that's uncommon to happen, but sometimes you might not always hear it referred to as delegated design. I feel like in my professional life, we don't really use that term as often, but we definitely do take part in this process. So anyway, back to the question. It told us pretty clearly at the end of that section. So we need to review for conformance with the design criteria.
Yeah, I think delegated design is somewhat of a niche concept, but it definitely can come up on the ARE, and it's important to know exactly what the architect should and shouldn't do when you're reviewing a submittal that's delegated design. And it really comes down to the whole understanding the concept behind delegated design. And it's kind of increasingly common. It happens a lot on specialized storefront systems like this question is, but also curtain wall systems can be a delegated design item if a specific manufacturer is going to take on the detailed design of that system. And really what you're doing when you delegate the design of something to another professional by including that in the construction, in the contract documents, is you're saying, I'm going to, as the architect, set forth some design criteria. So I'm going to say, like Emily said, what kind of glass we need to use, probably because that's a code requirement. I might specify in conjunction with the structural engineer what wind loads or other lateral loads might need to be designed for and applied to the design of the storefront. And my drawings are going to show generally where you would attach the storefront to the structure of the building, what the surrounding finishes are, and things like that. So you kind of leave it at that. That's what your contract documents show. And then it's up to the contractor to bring those documents to some manufacturers or subcontractors or whoever who are going to take the design from there, apply your design criteria to their specific system that they're proposing, and submit that back to you for review. And your only job is to make sure that they've designed it according to your design criteria that you set forth, and that it meets your standards that you specified either in the drawings or specs. So that's a really important process to understand. If you go above and beyond that and you start reviewing all of the detailed calculations with the structural engineer, or you start requesting changes to the mullions and things like that, you're first of all probably crossing a line in terms of liability that you don't want to be crossing. But there's also going to be this issue with the contractor where they bid the project understanding that this was delegated design and that they could that their engineer was going to design this component. So super important process to understand. Let's go on to number 6.
All right, this is our last question. So we'll get started. At the beginning of the 12-month construction phase, the client for a new library project wants to add an additional 10 custom millwork bookcases to the project. After consulting the construction schedule, the contractor tells the project team that the millwork has 5 weeks of float and that the additional bookcases will take 3 additional weeks to procure. The contract has a unit price for bookcases of $2,500 each, but the contractor says that the additional bookcases will actually cost $3,500 each because their subcontractor considers it to be a rush order. How should the architect document the change? Our options are: issue a minor change in the work, issue a construction change directive, issue a change order, or ask the contractor to prepare a change order. So I think this scenario seems to be focusing on the pricing changes. So that would lead me towards either issuing a change order or a construction change directive. So if we look to the A201, we can find more information about all these possible answers. So minor changes in work are 7.4, construction change directives are 7.3, and change orders are 7.2. I think those are all good section numbers to write down in your notes because it's pretty common that you'll get questions on the exam about change orders and construction change directives. So I don't think a minor change in work is appropriate, but let's read what the A201 has to say about this just to be sure. So minor changes of work are for changes that are consistent with the contract documents and do not involve change in the contract summertime. So from our scenario, we know that we are adding more bookcases that are not in the original CDs. So it doesn't seem like this is applicable to our situation. So next, let's review a change order. So it's prepared by the architect and signed by all three parties agreeing to a change in work, the amount of cost adjustment, and the extent of the time adjustment. So a change order is used to agree upon that. Next, let's read about a construction change directive. So this one is prepared by the architect and signed only by the architect and owner to direct work before an agreement on contract price or time is reached. So the purpose of construction change directives is just to keep the work moving and then to agree upon the compensation at a later date. But it's just something written and documented to keep the work moving before something is actually agreed upon. So in this scenario, nowhere does it say that the owner and contractor are both agreeing to the new costs of the additional bookcase. So since that isn't confirmed for us, I think our safest option is a construction change directive. So this option here, issue a construction change directive, is our correct answer.
Yeah, this is a super common question type that you'll see, and I could write 100 different questions that are essentially asking you the same thing, just with different scenarios. It's really important to understand the different use cases for minor changes in the work, construction change directives, and change orders. So you should read the A201 again and again and really internalize the different reasons you would use each of them. I doubt you'd see a question that simply says something like the architect wants to make a change and it doesn't affect the cost on some. Which of these should you use? And the answer would be minor change in the work. I don't think the question is going to specify to you the information that it does or doesn't change the cost or time, or whether or not the contractor and owner and architect are all on the same page. It's instead going to be like this, where there's a relatively long scenario and you have to read that scenario and understand those key points that the question is making about that will inform which type of documentation you use to document the change. So with that, we're going to move on to some Q&A. We could start with this one. Someone's asking, since this is an owner-led change, shouldn't this be a change order? Emily, you wanna take that one?
Asking about this specific question?
Yes. So they're asking, they're sort of equating where the change originates from with what type of documentation you need to use. So they're saying, since the owner wants to do this, shouldn't this be a change order?
Got it. Yeah, and I think the issue here is just the timeline and whether things are being agreed upon too. So it just goes to on the exam, you can never assume information that isn't there, or you shouldn't assume information that isn't there. So nowhere does it say that the owner is agreeing to this, or it doesn't even say the owner is not agreeing to this. But since we don't know that the owner is agreeing to the change in cost, we can't do a change order. A change order would have to have all parties agree. So a construction change directive, I think sometimes is looked at as always like more negative, but it can just be a matter that it's just to get things moving quickly. So the architect and the owner sign it and they have the contractor start work. And then later, maybe the owner is happy to go ahead and pay somewhere closer to that $3,500 range. They just didn't have the time to fully negotiate it and keep the project moving. So because it hasn't been signed by all three parties, a change order, or agreed upon by all three parties, a change order is not the best option here. A construction change directive is. Does that make
Yeah,
sense, Chris?
yeah, I agree with that. Totally. We've got another comment on this question, I guess, saying that there's no sentence that indicates that they have a conflict on the price. I'll speak a little bit about this. I think that you need to read between the lines a little bit. The sentence here that says the contract has a unit price for the bookcases of $2,500 each. That's when there's a unit price in a contract, that's binding. That's the whole point of unit prices, is so that the owner wants those to be included in a contract so that if they want to make a change just like this down the road, they'll know exactly how much that's going to cost. Now, the question further states that the contractor is saying that these bookcases are now going to cost an additional $1,000. They're going to cost $3,500 each because of a rush order situation. So if you read those two sentences, there's an implied disagreement here. So that's where you can that's how you can understand that. It's important to be able to read these situations and understand what the owner might be thinking, and the fact that they're going to fall back on this unit price in the contract in this situation. Let's move on here to question number 2. We had a couple of questions asking, well, we had one question asking why question number 2 is not a change directive. Emily, if you want to take that one.
Yeah, I'm sorry, just to refresh my memory, I am going to reread the question just so I can answer it best. So question 2, an architect is working on an addition to a school during the contract administration phase. The contract documents call for a new ADA compliant ramp with a 1 to 12 slope at one of the entrances to the building. The contractor built the ramp, but the architect noted that the slope of the ramp at the transition to the walkway is 1 to 11. The contractor believes this to be within the allowable concrete tolerances. Which of the following is an appropriate action for the project team to take? And the person was asking, why is it not a construction change directive? And I think this just goes to the timeline. The ramp is already built. Construction change directives are usually used to keep the project moving when something like the time or the amount of payment is not agreed upon. So they issue a construction change directive to keep the project moving, and they will negotiate or talk about the price, agree upon the price later. So that's not the situation we have here. The ramp has already been built. The ramp is built and it's built wrong. So that's why it's not the best option here. The other 3 options make more sense. Having the owner provide notice to the contractor that if they're not going to fix it, they're going to hire another contractor. Having the architect prepare that change order for the new contractor, if that's how it goes. And I guess first would be the owner could direct the contractor to stop the work. So these are the better options since the ramp is already built. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. We had another question asking about choice 2 here, saying that the question doesn't indicate that the project's complete. Whether or not the project doesn't have to be complete for a construction change directive to be used. I just wanted to make that clarification. And I would say another reason CCD, a change order or a minor change in the work, none of those change methods of documenting changes make sense in this situation, because you're not actually asking the contractor to, you're not, there's no change that's being requested. You're asking the contractor to make what they built conform with the original contract documents. Those 3 ways of documenting changes are all for if something is changing about the contract documents. So that's really important to understand. They are never used actually if the contractor built something incorrectly, because you're not asking them to make a change per se. You're asking them to, I guess, fix and bring into conformance the built project. Let's see here. On question 3, somebody simply said, is glue down not regular? I would say that if you're a contractor and you deal with wood flooring, you should know that it might be glued down, it might just be nailed down. Those are 2 like totally reasonable ways of applying wood flooring to a substrate. So there's another important part of the A201. I don't know the section number off the top of my head, but it talks about the contractor becoming familiar with the site conditions and having walked the site, and they're familiar with the contract documents and all that. So that's really in there to protect the architect from and the owner from statements like this from a contractor that they didn't realize something about the site. The owner and architect can point to that part of the A201 and say, well, you really should have realized or should have at least asked the question about how, in this case, the wood flooring is attached. Let's see, we got a little bit of an off-topic question, but somebody asked if we could discuss the terms review or approved. I think this was probably in relation to question number 4. Emily, I'd love your take on this, but I just want to preface this by saying I don't think this is something you need to worry about for the ARE. It's definitely like a legal issue that architects deal with when they're reviewing submittals, but I think it would be really unfair if a question asked you what you should do with a submittal, and then everything seems right about the submittal, and then there's 2 choices, one that's marked reviewed and one that's marked approved. Also, in the in the interest of protecting everyone's liability, I'm just going to say that we're going to offer some advice here for the purposes of the ARE, and this is not legal advice. All right, Emily, take it away. What do you think, reviewed or approved?
Oh, that is such a good question, and also such a hard question, because as I was like learning about construction administration, I feel like this was such a question that I had to ask all the time, because all the time it came up, and like different like Procore and different ways you approve submittals will say they'll have different options. Some will say reviewed, some will say approved. So Chris, I will let you tell me if I'm right or wrong, because it's very possible I could be wrong. But I feel like I got the advice not to say approved, to say reviewed. And that was the safer bet legally. But Chris, if you have better insight for what the exam wants, I would definitely like to hear it.
Yeah, I agree. I would not use the word approved. I think you can use some other term. The offices I've worked at all used no exceptions taken instead of approved. But like I said, I don't think this is really an airy topic. It's just sort of fun to talk about, I guess, amongst nerdy architects. So let's see. I've got quite a few questions. I'm just trying to pick one here. I forget which question number this is related to, but somebody asked, would the rush order element of this question lead us toward a timeline issue, pushing us towards a change directive? And if I just look at the questions here, I think that that's about question 5, 6, question 6.
So, I mean, I'm a little confused by that question, because pushing us towards a construction change directive, that was our answer. So the way the question you just asked kind of made it seem like that wasn't the correct answer. But so it's a construction change directive in this case, because we don't know that all parties have agreed upon the amount change for money. So I guess if you're asking about the timeline, it says we have 5 weeks of float, and that the additional bookcases will take 3 additional weeks to procure. Correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, but that makes me think that there isn't going to be like an extension of the overall construction timeline. So I think it's more about the money in this question.
I think it's more about the money. Nothing says that the bookcases are on the critical path, and I would hope that they're not on a construction schedule. So I would say that the fact that it's a rush order is somewhat irrelevant. Full disclosure, I wrote this question, and I was just trying to provide a reasoning for the contractor about why they think it should cost more money, even though they had a unit price in the contract. What I wouldn't do is equate the fact that it's a rush order and have that inform your decision about how to document this change. When you're thinking about how to document a change, whether you're going to use minor change in the work, CCD, or change order, it's all about, does it affect the contract sum or time? That's question 1. If it doesn't, it's a minor change in the work. And then if it does, Question 2 is it's a simple decision tree. If it does affect contract sum or time, either or both, the next question is, does everybody agree about how much or how long, how much longer it's going to take? If everybody agrees, simple change order. If there's no agreement, it's a CCD. There's really no other factor that you have to take into consideration about which of these documentation methods to use. Everything
Oh,
else is,
sorry,
oh,
Chris.
go ahead.
I thought you were finishing up there. You definitely understood what they were asking better than I did and explained that great. I would just like to add, for those who haven't attempted a test yet, it is also very, very common for the questions to have additional information that isn't relevant too. They like to add in tons of information and see if you can find what is the key information. So now that I understand what you're asking, I understand why you were looking to that. But I would just say that, is some extra information that, like Chris said, you wouldn't actually need to use to inform your decision making.
Yeah. We've got a question relevant to the A201, but not necessarily to the questions that we talked about today, but I think it's a good one. So let's talk about it. What is the difference between observation and inspection on a job site?
That's a great question. So observation and inspection. So I don't have the sections of the A201 pulled up. I don't know if you know them, Chris. If you do, you can jump in. But observation, I feel like the architect, it's always we will go to the job site and we will observe. Inspection, I feel like, is like another tier. Like, it is known that you're going to be at the job site, you're going to observe. How often you do that is also a different topic, but I feel like that is the one architects are going to do that. I feel like inspection takes it a step further, and maybe that only comes when we assume something is wrong, and then we order inspections to be done to verify that maybe it's like the foundation, that it was actually built correctly. If we have like an inkling that it wasn't, whenever we do go to observe, then we order an inspection to happen. Chris, definitely correct me if that's not right.
Yeah, no, you got it. I would say that when the architect is just going to the site to visit the site, that's always called an observation. And because if you call it an inspection, it starts to get into this muddy area of are you inspecting the contractor's work? Are you in charge of means and methods? Are you directing them to do anything? That's why we don't call regular field visits inspections. They should be called observations. And if you look at A201, I had the luxury of looking this up while Emily was talking, so I have it in front of me. But A201 4.2.2 talks about the architect visiting the site, I'm paraphrasing, at intervals appropriate to the stage of construction, to become generally familiar with the work in progress. That word generally is really important. Not intimately familiar, but just generally. And to determine if, in general, again, the work observed is being performed blah, 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 indicating that when it's done, it will be in accordance with the contract documents. So field visits, I would always call them observations. That's also why the reports that you generate after a field visit are typically called field observation reports and not inspection report number one, number two. Now, inspections, there's two kinds of inspections. There's Emily's talking about like required inspections by a third party agency that might happen. You shouldn't be doing them as the architect. This is a third party inspection. It might be, they're usually required by code. They could be for things like your welds, plumbing inspections, electrical inspections, things like that. So those are one type of inspection. The architect also makes two inspections, only two, and those are at substantial completion and final completion. Those are the only time that you as the architect should be using the word inspect. So let's see, we have time for one more, I think. Just trying to pick which one here. Emily, maybe if you could just go over the answer to question 4 again briefly. Somebody was a little bit confused about it.
Sure, let's bring it back up. So which party is likely to be found to be responsible at a dispute resolution hearing for purchasing new trash disposal units? And our answer was the contractor. So essentially, this had to do with appropriately submitting submittals, and that wasn't followed. So we referenced a couple sections in the A201 about submittals, but the key point here was the contractor needs to direct specific attention to revisions other than those requested by the architect. So the architect sent back a submittal for the dishwashers because they were the incorrect models. And then the contractor resubmitted that dishwasher submittal, which is what the architect was expecting, with the correct dishwashers. But then they also threw in with that same submittal a new model for the trash disposal. But they didn't call any attention that they also threw in the trash disposal stuff. It wasn't bubbled or anything. Bubbling it is a way that you would be calling attention to it. So the architect approved the submittal because they were looking at the bubbled information of the correct dishwashers. There was no attention called to the extra information. So that's why they're not at fault in this situation, because of that specific section in the A201 that says they need to be drawing attention to it, and they didn't. So that's why the contractor is the one the most at fault here. Does that make more sense?
I think so, yeah. And I think the reason bubbling is required by the A201 and why it's important is that when it comes to resubmittals, and I'm sure many of you have reviewed submittals before, the reason bubbling is important is that when you're reviewing that second, third, hopefully not fourth version, it would take a really long time if you had to review the entire submittal again. So the process you should be going through as you review submittals is the V1 is the version 1 is pretty comprehensive. You review everything you need to review, and then any subsequent versions that you're reviewing, you're only reviewing anything that has changed with it, which the contractor has to call your attention to. This is a time saver. It helps cut down your costs as the architect and helps you stay on schedule with your submittal reviews. So I did say that would be the last one. I have one, I'm just gonna go over one more question one more time. Question 2, Emily, if you could just go back to it. Somebody asked, why does a change order need to be prepared if another contractor is hired? So I'll just answer this one quickly. The reason is that if this original contractor was going to remove the flooring and they're now no longer going to remove it, you need a change order because their contract sum, their cost of the work, includes removing that flooring. So you need a change order to deduct that from their price. Remember, change orders can be additive or subtractive. So in this case, it would be a subtractive or deductive change order to remove that scope of work from this contractor. Then the owner will have some money to pay the new contractor to remove the flooring. All right, sorry about that last one, Emily. I know I'm making you jump around in the slides, but let's
No worries.
end it. So that's it for today. Just a reminder that our next ARI Live will be June 15th, and we'll be talking about one of my favorite topics, zoning ordinances. You can go to go.blackspectacles.com/podcast to sign up or check out the community page for this episode. Finally, please stick around for a few minutes after the broadcast to take our survey and share any suggestions you have for future episodes of ARI Live. I promise we read them all and we use your feedback to make this podcast as helpful as it can be. Thanks for watching.
Thanks, everyone.